Welcome everybody to today's episode of the Great Birth Rebellion podcast, where we grapple with current research and historical knowledge to help you get the best out of your pregnancy, birth and postpartum journey. My name is Dr. Melanie Jackson at Melanie the Midwife. I'm a clinical and research midwife with my PhD, which is why I send out a weekly email which contains the resources that we use to create every single Great Birth Rebellion episode. You can join the podcast mailing list at melaniethemidwife.com. Our Great Birth Rebellion premium members also get access to podcast transcripts, additional resources, the Ask Mel a Question button, and an exclusive monthly Ask Me Anything episode where I answer listener questions. That said, let's get into it. Hi there, and welcome to today's episode of the Great Birth Rebellion podcast. Today, I'm back answering listener questions that have been submitted on the Premium Members Hub for this podcast. Premium members get an exclusive podcast episode every month only for them, and it addresses the questions that they've submitted via the Ask Mel a Question button. The Hub is for listeners who value this podcast enough to invest a small amount of $9 a month to fund the production of this podcast and support my work in keeping the quality and content of this podcast strong and regular. That's what helps get babies out, and it also gets podcast episodes out. Premium Hub members also get access to additional resources, transcripts for each episode. Cheat sheets are also coming, so little executive summaries. They are currently in the works. Today's premium episode answers these listener questions. Number 1, how do you or would you support a woman who begins involuntary pushing before being fully dilated? Second question, how do I get my partner on board with my plans to home birth? Third question, is there ever a good time to use a CTG monitor? We did have an episode with Dr. Kirsten Small that talked about CTG, which painted a grim picture of the quality of evidence around the use of CTG, but this listener is wondering if there's ever a time where CTG would benefit a woman in labour. Next question is from a woman who would love to get into birth work and supporting women in birth, but is wondering how the best way is to get experience in helping women so that she can make it her profession as a birth support doula. And final question is about placentas and blood loss after birth. So we'll be talking about if a previous postpartum hemorrhage predisposes you to another one in your next pregnancy, and also information about retained placenta. So if your placenta doesn't come out, is that likely to happen again in your next pregnancy? Those are the questions I'll be answering in the Premium Members Hub, but today for you who are listening right now, I'm going to answer the very first question, which is how do you support a woman who begins to involuntary push, so gets an urge to push her baby out before your cervix is fully dilated? Okay, so those not in the know about what this question is asking, the question is how do you as a midwife or even a doula or support person, how can you help with this? How do you support a labouring woman when she starts to feel an urge to push, but you've determined that her cervix is not fully dilated yet? So this can happen, especially when midwives are doing frequent 4-hourly cervical exams or vaginal examinations during labour. Midwives discover that the woman has an urge to push out her baby, but her cervix isn't fully out of the way yet. And I'm sure this person who asked this question is hoping for a list of strategies to help a woman through this, and I am going to offer that. But first, let's have a look at what we currently know from the research literature about this. So if you're looking at this topic in academic literature, the search term that will yield the most helpful information would be typing in early pushing urge, EPU. An early pushing urge is the presence of a strong maternal urge to bear down before the woman's been diagnosed as having fully dilated cervix. So some people believe that this is 10 centimetres. However, your cervix doesn't have to be 10 centimetres in order for you to push your baby through there. Some babies need your cervix to dilate more. Some babies can come through a less dilated cervix. But that's the vague idea of what is an early pushing urge. You want, your body tries to push the baby out, but your cervix isn't fully out of the way yet. And the term early rather than premature urge is used, and it's the preferred terminology, because if we use the word premature, that implies that the urge is pathological, that there's something wrong with it, and that it's taking place at the wrong time. But an early pushing urge gives the impression that it could be normal in some circumstances, could be pathological in others. And it's a phenomenon which most midwives are familiar with, but of course, I'm going to reveal some controversies, yes, around the optimum approach to manage this situation. Firstly, an early urge to push, an EPU, is only possible if midwives are actually doing vaginal examinations. And we have done an episode on vaginal examinations, episode 10 actually, which I'm about to give a revamp. If you've been here a while, you may have heard episode 10. If not, feel free to go back. It's valuable to help understand the place of vaginal examinations during labour, and you'll get an idea of what I think of them. But you'll know, if you've been here a while, that I work clinically as a private midwife, usually for women who are planning home births. And in that way of working, vaginal examinations are not a routine part of our care. Most of my clients will not receive a vaginal examination or even have a reason for me to do one. Of course, there are clinical situations where they can be helpful to provide information, and I would use them if I was trying to make a clinical decision, but not as a routine check during labour, not like they're done in many hospitals where they can be 2 to 4 hourly, routinely done on well healthy women and babies. So early pushing urge is only really possible to diagnose if you are doing vaginal exams, and what I'm getting at here is that I so rarely encounter it because I'm not checking. But different incidence rates, or the amount of time that this occurs for women, is reported in the literature. So even though I can't comment on it, from my experience, in the literature, some papers say about 7% of women will experience it. Others have been up to 54%. So it's not uncommon by any means. And if it does indeed occur so regularly, it may be a physiological process for some women and babies. However, there's no definitive evidence from controlled studies of the consequences for a mother or a baby, depending on what's done in this circumstance, if a woman has an early urge to push and is not fully dilated. So as I said, I certainly don't know how many of my clients have had an early urge to push versus just an urge to push their baby out, because I so rarely do vaginal examinations. I trust that the urge has a meaning and that the woman is doing what she feels is necessary. And the only time I would check is if the woman has been pushing for over an hour and we haven't seen any change, or if the baby's heart rate is showing signs of some kind of distress or change. So if I'm not checking, many of you might be thinking, if I'm not checking, what happens if the woman starts to push and her cervix isn't fully dilated? Isn't that problematic? There is a belief that pushing before you're fully dilated will create an oedematous cervix, where a woman's cervix becomes swollen and thick. And a swollen cervix is what many midwives and doctors believe will occur if the woman pushes on her cervix and it's not fully dilated or fully out of the way. They believe that it gets swollen and thick and full of fluid, and that this will prevent a woman's cervix from dilating further. Firstly, I can tell you that in 16 years of clinical practice, while I've encountered women getting an early urge to push, I haven't experienced a time with a woman at home where her cervix has become swollen. The only time I do recall was a client who was birthing in hospital. She had a private obstetrician and she'd hired me as her private midwife. And she'd reached 8 centimetres dilated, and then she had an urge to push, and it was discovered that she was 8 centimetres dilated and that her cervix was swollen. And her obstetrician immediately recommended a caesarean section, but instead the woman opted for an epidural, and I dosed her up with some homeopathic arnica every 15 minutes, and I rolled her on her side instead of on her back with the epidural, and we breathed through each tightening. And in these circumstances, her cervix dilated and it moved, and she had her VBAC as planned. So that was one strategy that I've used, but this is one experience that stands out for me. However, the evidence around this issue is very, very limited. There's no new formal evidence that has been published since 1987. So I was born in 84 and I turned 40 this year. So we're relying on information from 1987. There's been nothing new. And there's been no clear data about the prevalence, how often it actually happens, or even the nature of this phenomenon. We simply don't know if this is physiological, which I'm going to suggest that mostly it could be just based on my clinical work and what I've learned about watching it for the last 16 years. However, medical beliefs around birth have taught us that a swollen cervix is wrong and that pushing before you're fully dilated is wrong and pathological and that it's going to cause damage to you or your baby. But that has not been discovered from research. That is mostly medical assumption and a failure to wait to see what will happen next. So although an early pushing urge has been traditionally considered as pathological, there are some authors who have written about the possibility of increased risk of cervical damage to your cervix, or women getting tired because they're pushing and not going anywhere and they're exhausting themselves. But more recently, researchers have been reconsidering this early pushing urge as a physiological phenomenon, especially where good maternal and where the mum and the baby are in good condition and you can't see anything else that's going on. If that's the case, the research is asking, can we just assume that this is a normal part of labour? That said, let's firstly look at the possible reasons why a woman would feel like pushing before she's fully dilated, and then I'm going to move on to how we could possibly manage this situation. So the first reason is just because. For no reason. This is just what the woman's body does in labour and it's completely normal and we don't have to do anything. Secondly, this could happen if the woman's bag of waters is protruding out beyond the baby's head, sort of out of the cervix and into the vagina and triggering that sensation. The other thing that sometimes makes women feel like pushing before they're fully dilated is if the baby's head is positioned sort of tilted slightly to the side. We call this asynclitic. Or if the baby's in a posterior position. So the baby, if you imagine your baby lying in your belly, the baby's back is on your back and it's facing out towards your belly button. Whereas in an anterior position, which is how it's easier to get it out, the baby's back is along where your belly button is and it's looking towards your tailbone. So if your baby's in a posterior position, it can trigger an early urge to push. The other time I have seen this is where the baby was really low in the woman's pelvis, and so she had an urge, but the baby was still wearing the cervix as a beanie, and the cervix was not dilated. So the baby was super low and kind of dragging the cervix down with it and causing that urge, but the cervix wasn't out of the way. Sometimes if the baby's breech, a little part of the baby can trigger that urge. And also consider that some babies, as I said earlier, can come through a less dilated cervix depending on their size. Some need more or less dilation. But I think we should stop putting 10 centimeters as the number value on fully dilated, because fully dilated is actually different depending on what the baby needs. So to the question, how is this managed? How would I manage it? So firstly, if you are a person where you don't need to do vaginal examinations with your work as a midwife, the chances are that you'll be in this situation very rarely and you won't need to do anything because it will self-resolve. If it's happening, you won't know about it. But if we look at what is actually being done by midwives, there is some research about what midwives are doing to help women through this. So they have surveyed midwives about what do you do? This is not an unanswered question, so we've got survey information. And one research paper said that despite the absence of strong evidence of what to do, one study found when they surveyed 1,500 midwives in the US, 45.5% encourage a no-push approach in these circumstances. And a UK study found similar, where 43% of the midwives said that they would actively discourage early pushing by using techniques such as changing the woman's position or offering pain relief, usually in the form of an epidural, is what they would use to help a woman stop having the urge to push. So about half the midwives surveyed in these studies said that they would help a woman change position and discourage her from pushing or offer epidural to help stop the urge to bear down. So if this is the approach that you as a woman would like to take, or if you're a midwife listening, I'll explain the positioning that might be helpful if you are feeling an early urge to push but you're not fully dilated. And I will also say here that it's entirely possible that you're getting that urge because your baby is ready to come out and your cervix is just gearing up to move right out of the way in an instant. So there is a line between just listening to your body and going with it. But if you do want to do something other than go with the flow in this circumstance, you can try a few things. So the position changes are basically any position that lifts your baby off your cervix for a little bit and out of the pelvic space for a little bit. Now, this is the opposite of what you want to do in birth because the idea is that your baby is supposed to come down and out, but sometimes it's needed or wanted. And so we use these specifically if the urge to push relates to an odd position of the baby's head. So if it's tilted, asynclitic, or if it's posterior. These positions can help reposition the baby to help settle the urge. But ultimately, you want the baby down and out, not up and off the cervix. So with early pressure, you can encourage the woman, or if you're a woman listening, you can get in a big pool where your body is actually buoyant. And so gravity is not able to act as strongly on the position of your baby. And the weight of the water kind of dissipates the amount of tug on your baby. And in this circumstance, I would do it regardless of how dilated the woman is. So some midwives won't encourage the use of water if you're in earlier labor because it can slow down labor. But in this circumstance, we're using it therapeutically. It's different. So I would encourage the woman into the water if she's got a big body of water able there to be used. And it provides the woman's body with an opportunity to rest and allow the baby to move off the cervix and change position. The other way to take the pressure off is to help the woman into a side lying position, and this can be helped with lots of pillows and a peanut ball between her legs, and you can go side to side. Sometimes one side of the cervix is more swollen than the other, so you basically want to take the pressure off the swollen part of the cervix if that's what's happening. So if the right side of her cervix is swollen, lay her on her left. The other really effective way that I've used before, particularly for babies that are asynclitic or posterior, is this exaggerated head down, bum up position. It's not particularly comfortable for women in labour, but it's super effective. To start with, you want to pile up a few pillows, 2 or 3 if you can, and the woman's knees will go on the pile of pillows, and then she'll go forward onto her elbows. So she's kind of in a hands and knees position, but onto her elbows, and she can rest her head on a pillow down on the ground. So what you end up having is the bum is higher than her head and shoulders, and so her belly is pendulous, but gravitational pull, hopefully, is kind of going to lift the baby out of the pelvis a bit because she's on quite an exaggerated angle. And then as she gets a contraction, encourage the woman, or if you're the woman listening, rotate your hips in kind of a figure 8 position. You want to create big movement in your pelvis to sort of shuffle the baby down and out of your pelvis for a little bit. And then once you've done about 10 contractions in that position, sideways step up and down some stairs. Up and down. This is kind of like the curb walking that some people talk about. So you want to go side to side to side, all the way up the stairs, turn around and go back down again. And the idea, it's kind of like shuffling, spaghetti into a container. You want to shuffle the baby back down, but in a really good position. So that can help the head down, bum up situation. And then pairing that with the sideways stairs to reposition the baby and get it back down into the pelvis. And the other possibility, which is a little bit harder, but for women who are standing up, or if you're on the toilet, or if you're sitting on a birth stool or somewhere where your body's more upright, someone can help you with this. but you literally grab your belly and lift it up. And if you pair that with a little bit of a lean backwards, it's a way to, again, lift your baby up out of your pelvis and bring it off your cervix a little bit, and potentially enough to resolve whatever's going on. That's more of a fleeting solution, but you could do it with each contraction or just periodically. So if you're using the stop-push technique, then encouraging the woman to vocalize with her contractions and call out the energy upwards instead of downwards, and breathing through contractions instead of going with the urge, that can help. So the few techniques that you could use from what I've just said is the stop-push technique, where midwives literally say, don't push. That's really hard if your body's physiologically pushing. Honestly, if you've been in that situation and you manage to resist that urge, hats off to you, because that urge is physiological. That is your body doing that. But you can try not to add anything to that urge by focusing on your breath, and perhaps the episode with Emma that we did on breath work could be helpful, and applying these other positional techniques. And while you're encouraging, if you're a type of person who would be encouraging a woman not to push with these contractions, then things like hip squeezes and back massage and going with the woman on the breath and really talking her through each one can be other ways to help her work through this. If you're asking a woman to do this, you need to be right there assisting, because it's not easy for her. So that was position change and the stop pushing option. The next option that the research revealed about midwives' actions around this is that some midwives just suggest for the woman to go along with the urges, especially if the woman has been diagnosed as having an early urge to push and she's sort of 8 or 9 centimeters. There's some acknowledgement from midwives that when women are 8 or 9 centimeters, if they have an urge to push, that potentially the cervix is just going to open under that pressure and the baby's going to be able to be born through an 8 or 9 centimeter dilated cervix. And so in their minds, they're just like, yeah, push, see what happens. So that is entirely possible to do, and an option that midwives around the world seem to be using. In one study, it was approximately 15% of midwives who opted for this strategy. All right, and I can't escape the discussion around epidurals in this situation. Certainly, if you're working in a system that does not value physiology, and where this idea of early urge to push or swollen cervix is considered a pathological situation, sometimes women will just immediately be offered a cesarean section. I've seen this way too many times where it's not considered a reversible circumstance. And in that situation, I have seen midwives offer an epidural as an alternative to a cesarean section, as a bit of a Hail Mary option of how can I help this woman stop getting an urge, in the hope that her cervix will not be swollen and that it will dilate and that her baby can come out. So that can be one reason for midwives offering an epidural. The other reason is maybe the woman wants it. Maybe that resisting that urge to push is so challenging that she wants some pharmacological help with that. And so that's certainly a very reasonable reason for a woman to have an epidural if that's what circumstance she's in and if that's what she wants. However, there's no available evidence to support the idea that early pushes are harmful in physiological conditions, and no data are available in the literature about the incidence of cervical damage occurring. And so if you're going to be offering interventions like epidurals or cesarean sections, just know that these aren't necessarily required of you based on the evidence. There are other options. So what I want to say here is that when midwives are confronted with these types of situations, they're faced with a complexity of other vested interests and power structures. So midwives could choose to listen to the labouring woman and just trust the birthing process and encourage her to go with those urges. Alternatively, they can succumb to the external pressures of what's happening with the hospital policies, or there's a subtle and coercive influence of other colleagues and this unspoken rule where women are not supposed to push without a fully dilated cervix. So that's what a lot of workplaces will have a general understanding in the workplace culture is that you should not allow, and I'm using speech marks, allow a woman to push before she's fully dilated. That's considered a no-no in some workplaces. And it's entirely possible that in modern maternity care, women who are in this situation are being distracted from responding to their own physiological cues in labor. And they're persuaded that these cues are dangerous and inappropriate and that they should stop it. And then they're faced with things like, if you don't stop, you're going to swell up your own cervix or your baby could get distressed. And so then the woman gets blamed for her own physiological function. So the question that arises is whether midwives should encourage women to do what she feels and go along with the pushes and assume that this is a normal part of physiology, or to suggest that there are some interventions that could help change circumstances. And these could range from trying to resist the urge, changing positions, using water. Also explaining to the woman what's happening in her body can also help to reassure her. So this remains an open question, and there is not enough evidence to determine what the optimum response to an early pushing urge is. But the actions will be different depending on the beliefs of the midwife and also the beliefs and the preference of the woman. And so if the woman wants to push and that's what she intends to do, the worst circumstance is where there is a mismatch between what the woman wants and what the midwife is willing to offer. So, if the woman is getting an early urge to push and she's of the mindset that she wants an epidural to help work through this, but the midwife who's with her wants to put her in the bath and offer her a massage and change her position and help her up and down the stairs, you've got a real mismatch. And so although the midwife's intentions are well intended, she wants to help the woman through this without an epidural, the woman wants an epidural. And once you've reached that point, if that midwife resists giving the woman what she wants, you're going to end up with disappointment from the woman. And vice versa. There might be a woman who desperately does not want an epidural and wants to try position changes and water and wants to have her midwife there for support and to help her breathe through each contraction. And the midwife is offering things like an epidural, or maybe you should have a cesarean, or giving her words like this could be dangerous and your cervix could swell up and you should stop doing this and doing that. And so the best case scenario is where both the midwife and woman are working together towards the woman's goals, not the midwife's goals. So if you ever get into this situation, my advice is to give the woman as much information as you possibly can about her options, reminding her also that this could be absolutely normal part of her labour. Better still, if you're a woman listening to this and you've listened beforehand, you can start to generate your own ideas of what you would want to do yourself in labour if this happens to you. That's what I've got for you today. The Premium Hub members will get more of this podcast episode. This was just question 1. The podcast Premium members are also currently working through the answers to how to get a partner on board with home birth. Is CTG ever beneficial in labour and birth? How can I get started in birth work? And what is the evidence around next birth if you've had a previous postpartum hemorrhage or a retained placenta? If the answers to any of those questions interest you, I'll invite you to join the Premium Members Hub. All the information's in the show notes below, and I will see you in the next episode of The Great Birth Rebellion. Thank you for being here for today's episode of the Great Birth Rebellion podcast. If you want to get access to all the resources that we use to create every single podcast episode, you can join the mailing list at melaniethemidwife.com, or better still, the Premium Members Hub. The Premium members get access to transcripts, the Ask Mel a Question button, an exclusive Ask Me Anything episode every month. All the details are in the show notes, and I will see you in the next episode of The Great Birth Rebellion.